delighted to be able to introduce Ethan Anthony from the famed Cram and Ferguson architecture firm. Ethan is the principal architect and president of Cram and Ferguson Architects since 1991. He earned a bachelor's degree of architecture at the University of Oregon and is president of the Central Massachusetts AIA. In 2017, Ethan received 3 awards for unbuilt and built religious institutions. In 2015, Anthony received the Award for Design Excellence for the Cassidy School Chapel and the IFRAA Honor Award for Unbuilt Architecture in 1993 and the Golden Trowel Award for Our Lady of Walsingham in 2004. During the last 3 decades, Anthony has designed numerous new traditional churches and has gained a national reputation for his work. Please help me welcome Ethan Anthony to the stage for his talk, Symphony of Creation.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Kathleen. That was a very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon, and I want to thank you all for inviting me and giving me another chance to enjoy being in Chicago, which is always a great pleasure. One of the great things about this event, I think, is that it celebrates and elevates art and beauty to its rightful place in the church. The place is what this is ultimately all about, the place of art in our lives and in our worship. And it's been famously said that art is the mother, that religion is the mother of all arts. And I think that that was the way very much at a time, and then somehow along the way we lost that connection. Throughout history, artists, architects, and theologians have often developed prescriptions for achieving beauty in building and the arts. The earliest of these is the 10 books on architecture, which many of you, I think there are some architects here, but all of you have certainly heard of that. It was written by Marcus Vitruvius Pollio, a Roman architect and engineer who lived in the 1st century BC. You may know of St. Charles Borromeo's Instructiones Fabricae et Superelectilis Ecclesiasticae, which is a very early application of the teachings of the Council of Trent to church architecture. And actually, we are still using that today. We have it in our library. And in the post-Reformation era, the revival of Catholic church design was guided by the true principles of pointed or Christian architecture of Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, which was published in 1841. And this also is a book that we currently use in our work. In our own era, we've had the Sacrosanctum Concilium, promulgated in 1963, and better known as Vatican II. And more recently, Built of Living Stones was published by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops in 2000. It's a theological reflection on the liturgy and church architecture, including church planning and art and worship spaces. And in addition, in the last 15 years, a number of books have questioned the teachings of Vatican II in favor of a return to those of Borromeo and Pugin. So, in addition, we architects have the bishop, the pastor, the building committee, which you see here. This is a building committee meeting, and this isn't even the whole, this is just a little portion of this building committee. And of course, the diocesan councils play a part. And after taking into account all of these, the architect must carefully consider and solve the program needs, of course. And this must be done while respecting both, not to forget the government, building codes. And at the end, we want to achieve a great and beautiful space fit for the Catholic liturgy. but all too often, we end up with this. And this is a little unfair because this is about 10, 12 years old. It's a church in Los Angeles. But really, an architect actually proposed this and designed it, and it was built. And I'm sure it fit the budget, at least that. And finally, to speak of budgets, if all of the rest that we've just discussed wasn't enough, usually the budget is too small to provide greatness of materials or finishes or any decent artwork, let alone art glass windows. So this is a church we designed about 8 or 9 years ago. It's called St. John Newman in a suburb of Knoxville, Tennessee. And how do we architects of this new round of American Catholic churches avoid mediocrity and find a path through these many difficulties and restrictions to create a building which is beautiful and holy and filled with the Spirit? How can the architect function as a resource for the parish and the pastor? If this new creation is to include the art and craft of other individual creators, how does the architect conduct this sometimes cacophonous orchestra and achieve a coordinated symphony of creativity? And did I forget to mention beauty? We know it when we see it, as these last two talks have so well demonstrated. We feel it. It goes to the core of our being. It touches us personally. It breaks through our defenses and our sophistication. Can beauty still be a possibility after all of the rest of that stuff is taken care of and is done? And this is actually a church we're designing right now. This is an interior renovation of a church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, which was a 1980s era box. And this is what we're about to do to it. So finding and following beauty, it's the beginning and end of my everyday. By the way, this is a Matthew Alderman sketch. And Matthew and I work together. I want to give him credit. A lot of you here know him, so he would kill me if I didn't tell you. Finding and following beauty is the beginning and end of my everyday. I know it is a thing that it exists. In fact, I spend much of my time judging the beauty of the work of the multitude of artists, crafters, and contractors who are often working on projects that are far away from our office. This is a sort of thing that's going on all the time. This is on top of an 85-foot high scaffolding, and the painters have erected another scaffolding on top of that, and they're up there painting the inscription that goes around that dome that you just saw a minute ago. When the concerted efforts of so many are required to produce a project, how can so many different people come together? And how can the architect guide the crafter or artist and still allow them freedom to contribute? So here you see one of our recent church projects, and I'm over there on the right side talking to people, and there's all kinds of stuff going on, and it's just a vision of chaos through most of the time that the building is under construction, and things can go wrong. You have to really pay attention all the way through. And this is an angel that's being produced in a studio, again, far away from our office, to our drawings, but by a new process which we had never used before, which was a very light process of sculpting it in clay and then molding it in a resin base. How can one director provide guidance that may not be understood by the workers who produce the work? or even the owner who pays for it until it is substantially complete? Can a guiding vision overcome differing levels of skill and conflicting ideas and guide the owner, the user, and the many producers to a cohesive and beautiful result? This is another workshop in Colombia, South America, where a lot of our woodwork is produced. And this is the very dedicated crew of people who work on that, and their architect there who guides the work for me. We have actually 2 architects who work on this, a local architect, and that's just to produce things like you see here, which is the pulpit. This is actually the pulpit for Our Lady of Walsingham in Houston, Texas. Ralph Adams Cram, who founded our firm, wrote in 1914, "Every architect knows that the success of his work," and you have to forgive Cram, he wrote in a time when women didn't do anything, depends largely, I mean that as a joke, really. It depends largely on the craftsmen who carry it out and complete it with all its decorative features of form and color. And yet in a nation of 100 million people, with a dozen schools of architecture, practically nothing is done toward educating these same craftsmen. And either we secure the services of foreign-trained men, accept 10th-rate native work, or go without. Well, that was the situation then. It's different now. I'm happy to say that in the 20 years that we've been doing this, we've gone from struggling to find crafters and artists, and now are finding many people who are stepping up to the plate and really getting involved and wanting to do this kind of work. So the situation actually remained as Cram described it through the 1960s, but it has improved in the last 10 years. There are now schools of traditional art and craft in some major cities. And crafters of high skill are becoming available as the demand for that kind of work begins to grow. And the great art workshops of the past, such as those of Rembrandt, which you see here, and Rodin here, and John Angel here. And John Angel was a sculptor who worked with our office in the 1930s, and this is sculpting the great Last Supper scene, which is in East Liberty Presbyterian Church in Pittsburgh. So the greater workshops of the past depended on assistants working more or less independently, all learning the work from the master and each other, and all gaining a common understanding of what beauty was, often based on precedent. So, and here we see today that this great workshop is still going on in many different small places. And this is a group of crafts workers who were working on a church for us in Boston and assembling actually an altar. And we were told in this project we had to take parts and pieces from closed churches all over the Boston Archdiocese. We actually used parts from about 10 different churches. So this altar was rescued from a church which was ultimately torn down, and the altar behind it as well, which and all of these things were partially used, and then we had to match the work. So the back side of that altar was completely recreated to match the front. So it was quite a challenge to really step up to the plate now and try to match work that was done 100 years ago. So as the great artists did, we now gather around us a small group of arts and crafts specialists who carry out this vision and contribute as they produce artifacts and parts of buildings that follow these principles. We provide guidance for the wood, stone, and ironwork and other skills needed to complete the project. Truly, the architect is a composer and a conductor to the orchestra of arts and crafts workers who create the building. They're a symphony. And here you see actually the carver. Actually, she's a sculptor, Danielle Kirchmer, who is the resident artist at Babson University, who sculpted all of the sculpted pieces that were included in St. John Newman. And we'll see a little bit more of that coming up. In this picture, she is working with Father Dowling, who was the priest of St. John Newman, and he's studiously selecting all of the iconography that will be on the building. And he literally did every window, every carved piece. It was an incredible effort. So we begin with the iconographic planning and a look at the traditional placements of iconography throughout the building. We start with a sketch, such as the one you see here. The placements for iconography are ultimately committed to drawings, and this begins an iterative process with the artists and crafters, and one that is more cycled than the typical shop drawing process, such as for producing wood cabinets, for example. These first loose drawings are then committed to CAD. So this is another sketch for a door that would be cast in bronze. The first one before became one of the symbols on the front of an altar. The artist then returns a submittal drawing, and actually this is the CAD drawing that results, and this is the CAD drawing for an altar. All of our work is completely designed for the church. We don't really copy anything. We certainly look to precedent and learn from it and try to understand what generated that idea and then come up with new ideas that are working with that. The artist then returns a submittal drawing, and this is a submittal drawing for some wrought iron work that was returned by, we work a lot with a local wrought iron studio. He's really an artist in wrought iron. And we say we need some hinges for this door, and we show him the size we want and the general design, and then he contributes to the design as well. So in this particular case, this was for a Dominican operated church, the church in Charlottesville, the University of Virginia Parish, and it is, there's a small Dominican order there that provides the priest for the church. And so we used a lot of Dominican symbols throughout the church. This submittal is critiqued by us, and then we return it to the artist with notes. And in sculpture, the next step after this step is the clay. So now we'll look at some clay. This is a submittal. Actually, we went to Pietrasanta, Italy to meet the sculptor who was sculpting this. This is the altar front for Our Lady of Mount Carmel here in Chicago. And this altar has been completed, it's installed, so if you ever happen by there, you can go and look at it. It's the road to Emmaus, and we were basing it on the Caravaggio painting, which you can see behind. So the sculptor was looking at the Caravaggio painting, which I happen to have fallen in love with, and I said, I really want it to look like that. And then basing the carving on that. And then when this is complete, this becomes the basis for the marble carving that's done. And actually, this is, I didn't have a picture of them carving that specific thing, but this is the shop. And this is the father of the guy who now runs the shop, working on a statue. So what guides us as director of this symphony? One writer who has provided clear guidance for us is Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, and you've heard him mentioned already once or twice. Pugin studied, measured, and sketched medieval Catholic churches across England. And he was doing that at the time when the Catholic Mass was still outlawed in England. You could actually go to jail for celebrating the Mass at that time. Pugin's father and actually left France during the French Revolution. As a Catholic, he wasn't a very good place to be. They weren't able to even practice as Catholics when they got to England because it was still outlawed there, but at least they weren't murdered or thrown off a cliff. And so when they got there, Pugin had to convert back to the Catholic Church after 1830, when the Catholic Emancipation Act was passed, and it was once more legal to practice the Catholic religion in England. And so he was preparing for that, and he began in 1835, he began the Gothic revival with this building, which is St. George's in Southwark, England. It's a cathedral. It was the first Gothic and first Catholic building to be built in England in 300 years, literally since the Reformation. So Pugin had a very important and initiating role in the Gothic revival. Much of the revival was framed by the books, the one I've already mentioned, The True Principles, and also his other book, Contrasts. In The True Principles of Pointed Architecture, Pugin wrote, there were two great rules for design. First, that there should be no features about a building which are not necessary for convenience, construction, or propriety. And this is a restating of the old idea that those are the main principles. That Pugin didn't invent that, but in a way he reinvented it. He brought it back into the consciousness of people at that time. And second, that all ornament should consist of enrichment of the essential construction of the building. So this is St. Giles. It's one of Pugin's most famous works. It's St. Giles and Cheadle. And on the outside, it's not really that much to look at these days. I mean, if you look at it, you think, wow. But it's a little unfair because, of course, that stonework was once very beautiful and new. And when he built that building, I think the most amazing thing about this is how simple the outside really is. It's very, very simple. It's the Cistercians would like this. You know, it's not at all. And the ornamentation, you can see, you know, the pinnacles are actually necessary for the design of the building. They provide weight at the corners to hold the building together. But there is where the ornament is actually occurring here. So it's very logical. It follows his two rules perfectly. But then we go inside, and it's a little bit like, how does this fit? You know, it's really elaborate. I mean, Pugin's ornament is just incredible. It's everywhere. It's all over the place. But all of his ornament is based on Christian symbolism of different kinds. So the cross figures very prominently. Marian symbolism is very prominent. If you look carefully at all of them, you'll start to see, and actually this is St. Giles there on the wall with a deer as part of his legend. But you can see that the diapering and the designs for all of these things are all based on the cross. They're based on the fleur-de-lis. I mean, there are many, many, many symbols are in there, and it's all done in a way that is very much working with the architecture, the way the thing is structured and put together. So even though it's really elaborate and really a bit over the top, it follows his principles. And here you see another example where the ornament is very much regulated by the design of the piece. In advocating an ornamented architecture, Pugin was advocating a return to an architecture that contained Catholic liturgical meaning after most aspects of the Catholic liturgy had been banished for 300 years. First by the Reformation of Henry VIII, he was right there, he was number one. Then in the Enlightenment, which you've all heard about in glowing terms in school here in this country. We think a lot of the Enlightenment in the United States. And in the French Revolution, when the Catholic Church and religion were systematically destroyed over a 10-year period, including pulling down the greatest and largest church in the world, which is the Church of Cluny. And part of that also, it was an iconoclasm. So the iconoclastic activity, you can see here, a lot of it was chopping the heads off the statues so that you could no longer tell which saint or which doctor or what part of the liturgy they could possibly have been celebrating. And this is another example of actually scratching the face off of a painting. During the Puritan years, Catholic ornament had become a particular target for the suppression of the Catholic liturgy. And the Puritans, and after them the French revolutionaries, stripped the saints and doctors of the church from the walls. And they also, actually this is out of order, I'll go to the one I want. They also super simplified the architecture and moved to a completely different idea, and that is the celebration of the English Renaissance celebration of Roman Classicism, which had none of those bothersome Catholic symbols in it, and it was a much more simple kind of a church. And this is a Christopher Wren church, St. Martin's in the Fields in London. It's actually a very nice church. It's just a completely different idea. It's the church where preaching the word was the thing rather than the liturgy, celebration of the liturgy. And that actually was very, very important because that spread over. After the Great Fire in London in 1640, that architecture became the architecture of churches in the United States and everywhere. So the reason why we had to have a Gothic revival was because of this kind of architecture. So Pugin began, after the Catholic Restoration Act, to work on new designs for a Catholic architecture that would replace this Roman classical architecture of the Renaissance. Catholics of the day were still persecuted and viewed the dominant architecture as pagan, based as it was on pagan temples and worship. But the Renaissance also had done much to simplify and remove liturgical information from the surfaces of buildings. So just one more look at the ceiling of St. Giles. If ornament was to be returned to the church once more, Pugin said it would have to be integral. Pugin felt that ornament must be limited to elaboration of the structure, what we today refer to as architectonic. This, he felt, would bring life to the underlying building and avoid mere decoration. During his short working life, he died at 42 years of age. He succeeded through his Gothic revival in reestablishing Gothic architecture as the language of religious building. And that language dominated English religious architecture until World War II. And here I have a photograph of Coventry Cathedral before it was bombed. And it was actually, I believe it was V2s that took it down. You see here Winston Churchill walking through the ruins of Coventry just after it was destroyed. And this is how Coventry Cathedral looks today. It has been rebuilt, but not like this. So what happened to ornament? Why don't we see it on our buildings today? After World War II, with the rise and dominance of the modern movement, the architect was once again told to delete all ornament. And with it, we lost the hand of the artist and the craftsman, the new iconoclasm. In the postmodern era that followed the decline of the modern movement, we have seen the reemergence of building arts and crafts, and our work is a part of that revival. We have continued the long-established practice within our firm of making space in the building for the work of arts and crafts. So here you see the interior of Our Lady of Walsingham. It's a church that was dedicated to the Walsingham miracle, and it has a rood beam, which you see going up across here, which is a very traditional English feature of English churches. We designed and had built the communion rail, which was seen with a certain horror by the Archdiocese of Houston at the time. And I think the cardinal was heard to say, "And I suppose you're going to have a communion rail." So a void space is created. And you see, this was just the beginning. I mean, we're doing much more now. We started with a very modest bit of artwork, but it becomes an iconographic statement, a bas-relief or a statue, a mural, iron hardware, custom-designed marble furnishings, altar, ambo, and tabernacle throne, carved and molded terminations in wood, glass, paint, and other new materials, and symbols that add layers of meaning onto the framework provided by the building. Here, actually, you see the Holy House of Walsingham recreated inside one of the transepts of the church, and this was what we were told. You will base this entire church on accommodating the Holy House in the actual size in one of the transepts. And that really generated everything about the church geometry. Adding iconography, and this is the pulpit that you saw actually in the workshop before. Adding iconography to the work is part of a process of design and partly a process of visualizing what the final result will be after the artist or crafter has added symbolic or representational meaning to an architectural element. Where in a Roman classical building, a column presents a plant form, this lunette over the door at St. John Neumann contains a scene that Father Dowling felt crystallized the relationship between the church and the parishioner. Matthew 19:14, "Let the little children come to me," in that saying, it crystallized his feeling that the church should be a pedagogical tool for the children in the parish school next door, as well as for the adults of the parish who are reminded that, like children, they too need to come to God with an open heart. And here is a wall carving of the angel of God showing the city of God to John. The creation of space for iconography and symbolic meaning becomes one important source of inspiration for the design. This building was also inspired by a French Romanesque building called the Cathedral of Autun, and I have a picture of what those columns look like. These, the big problem we had was we had, I think, 22 of these, and had we tried to carve them all in stone, I think it would have cost more than the building cost. So how to actually accomplish this in a building today? And what we did is sculpted them in clay and then cast them in architectural concrete. So those are architectural concrete castings that became the column capitals for this building. In our buildings, a column may be a representation of a biblical scene that is of vital importance to the liturgy and the life of the people. The artist and crafter fashioned parts of the building while adding a higher symbolic life. So this is the painting. Okay, so this is this was the inspiration for the columns at St. John Neumann. These are Romanesque carved columns on the cathedral at Autun. John Ruskin, to mention John Ruskin, in his work, The Stones of Venice, made the argument that the maker and the making were inextricably intertwined. And here you have a new stained glass window with the life of St. John Neumann as its subject matter. John Ruskin further noted that the Gothic architects created for the glory of God. And I think he was contrasting that to creating for their own glory. And he used as an example the Gothic architecture of Venice, which is used on buildings besides churches. This is the Doge's Palace, which is a social building. It is not a church building specifically. The Gothic building was the book of Christianity written in stone. And here you see a more recent church in Illinois. This is down in Ridgeway, Illinois, which is about 5.5 hours drive south of where we are today. And we have gargoyles on that building. And this is one of the gargoyles in the sculptor's studio in the process of being carved in clay. Every part of the creation is infused with a unique and critical message. The message of the building is its soul. And this is very interesting because the parish actually had, of this building, had an artist who wanted to do this tympanum over the entry door, and so that was done by one of the parish parishioners in this church. In fact, even the modern architect who avoids religious architecture describes modern buildings with a language that is derived from spiritual references. Mies said, "God is in the details." We all heard that one, I'm sure. At least all the architects here, I'm sure, have. Paolo Soleri titled one of his books, "The Bridge Between Matter and Spirit is Matter Becoming Spirit." Frank Lloyd Wright said, "Without an architecture of our own, we have no soul of our own civilization. Form and function," this still quotes, "form and function should be one, joined in a spiritual union." And here we have truly a spiritual union. This is a mausoleum we designed, and the doors of paradise are the result of that sketch that you saw previously. And this vines are actually cast in bronze on the front door. But we hear sometimes today that the building in which we worship does not matter. What is important, we are told, is that the body of the faithful, the congregation, the worshiper, wherever the worship takes place, are what matters. And that sounds good, but in fact, worship almost always takes place in a building. Further, the building imparts much to the essence of worship. In a recent essay, I'm going to move on to this, in the Jesuit publication America Magazine, the author described how on a visit to Rome, he came away feeling that a tree was more inspiring than the, quote, grandiose, unquote, churches of Europe. And I would contrast that with the trees in Bath Abbey, which, of course, one of the greatest fan-vaulted ceilings in Europe, which was indeed capturing the essence of nature within the building. For the author, though, only Gaudi's Sagrada Familia, which you see here, inspired him even in comparison to the great cathedrals. Wright expounded a similar theme. Quote, "I believe in God, only I spell it nature," unquote. Quote, "God is the great mysterious motivator of what we call nature, and it has often been said by philosophers that nature is the will of God. And I prefer to say that nature is the only body of God that we shall ever see." Can you tell that he was a Unitarian? Merely because it's stylized does not mean it's not natural. So I think that there's nature in the ceiling of Bath Abbey just as much as there is in that tree. And I see nature here. I see nature because there's a depiction of God at the top, God as the Holy Spirit at the top. And the whole panoply of our concept of liturgy is contained in this painting on the ceiling. So nature is indeed very nice. I like it. But it is not human worship. And those who espouse the beauty of nature as more beautiful than the beauty of the Catholic liturgy, writ in stone, risk losing the worshiper. Humankind finds great comfort in a familiar liturgy and a liturgical setting that contains reinforcing symbols and iconographic information. From the day of the sacred groves, our civilization has made places of the Spirit and remembrance, lest we forget in everyday life the values and spiritual knowledge we have gained. God, in a real sense, dwells in these places. How can they not be about God, contain God, be where God lives? So I'm going to close with a bunch of ruins, because that's what happens when you have iconoclasm. Iconoclasm has only one end. That's destruction. And that's what it's really all about, and that's what we're faced with today. It was to make sure that God was not alive in the great cathedrals or abbey churches that the rationalists and the naturalists of the French Revolution demolished so many great churches. And not to mention, along the way, they killed a lot of priests and nuns. Glastonbury Abbey, Sion Abbey, Tintern, Rievaulx, or Revis, I guess it should be, Fountains, this is Fountains, which is one of the most beautiful places to go. Literally thousands of great foundations, once homes for religious men and women, defiled, destroyed, desecrated, the occupants sometimes murdered, the great fabrics pulled down, and the stone stolen away to build great houses for the new rich of the land. Their spirit and the Spirit of God, to me, is still present in these great places. In all of these abbeys, even when the remains are only a tiny sliver of their former greatness, this greatness, this presence, instills me with awe to this day. Even when the bones that remain are only a few, only broken, only barely still there, they yet contain this power, this awe-inspiring presence, this inspiration, this infusion of the Spirit. And we pick up their work where they had to lay it down, to do the same work, to pick up the same spade and dig enthusiastically. Thank you.